what percentage of business world talk, jargon, advice, wisdom, what percentage of that is bullshit?
Oh, wow. I would say a fuck ton more than 50%. I'm like 80% of that
50 or 15?
50.
Oh,
Way more.
50.
Our discussion and something like this is more creative because like we just created a conversation, Matthew.
Oh yeah,
Like
this conversation is 100% bullshit. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and thank you especially to all of you who've had a chance to go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever it's called now, whatever distributor you listen to leave a rating, leave a review, just to subscribe, or, if you have a chance at some point, to recommend the show to somebody you think might like it. It does make a difference in getting the word out there. I don't do any real promotion on social media, so I am very grateful to all of you for spreading the word a little bit. That is enough of that bullshit. One more quick note. I wanted to give you a heads up because in an upcoming episode, either next week or maybe the week after, depending on my editing schedule, I'm going to be talking with Brian Platzer, who came on a few weeks ago to talk about the long piece in the Atlantic about the family who lost their son on 9/11. Brian is going to come back, and we're going to have a discussion about I'm Thinking of Ending Things, both the novel by Ian Reid and the movie by Charlie Kaufman. So if you have not read or watched these, they're worth reading, worth watching. The movie is, I think, only on Netflix, and it is not a date movie. I'll say that. We're going to talk. I think it should be a fun conversation. So just wanted to give you a heads up because we will be spoiling like gangbusters. So if you don't want to have the book or the movie spoiled, then be forewarned. This week's episode is going to be a divisive one, I suspect. I've been preparing this episode in one capacity or another for a month and a half now. All right, so in early August, I got an email from a guy who called himself Dale A. at Inflection Media, suggesting a potential guest, a spoken word poet for the podcast for me to interview. He listened to the Austin Allen interview. Great interview. It's a few episodes back. I'll put a link in the show notes again. But so Dale had listened to that episode and enjoyed it and made this recommendation. He suggested that I interview James Nguyen, who is a spoken word poet, who is mostly a businessman, really. He's been a contributing writer on Forbes. He's had appearances on a slew of big and small television stations, mostly in Australia. James is Australian. Dale introduced him as a 7-figure entrepreneur. I don't know what that means. I still don't know what that means. Looking him up, he did found a number of different companies, including, I think most recently, a cryptocurrency hedge fund. And to clarify, Dale works for James. So James runs Inflection Media. So this was this was James' company reaching out to promote his work rather than an independent recommendation. The problem for me was that I know fuck all about business, And the little I do know about spoken word, didn't recommend it to me as a likely topic of conversation for the podcast. But I sniffed around. I had a few nice exchanges with Dale, and then I got James agreed to just sit down and do an hour-long pre-interview with me, just open-ended. And he was an extremely generous, thoughtful guy, and I decided to give it a shot. So he was, as I said, it could not have been nicer. And I think we had a very, I think we had a fun conversation. First, though, I guess I have a confession, which is that, I know spoken word a little bit. I've certainly run into it here and there through popular culture, in college, a little bit in high school, certainly in grad school, a lot in Baltimore, actually. There was a decent, scene there. And I've run into it here and there on YouTube, and obviously most recently in the Amanda Gorman's celebrated inauguration poem, which was heavily influenced, let's say, by the spoken word scene or tradition. There's a variety, there's a range. It's not all one thing, spoken word. But when I think of spoken word, I have some prejudices. I tend to think of it as being trite. I tend to think of it as being a little bit simplistic, a little bit dumb, a little bit technically unadventurous, even formulaic. I tend to find the rhymes kind of predictable. The meter in cases, not meter exactly, but the rhythm, the emphatic delivery to be sort of pounding or sing-song too much. I also tend to find the message or the lessons that it imparts to be a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit sort of boringly conventional, conservative, didactic. I find it, I guess above all, to be kind of corny. I mean, that's really the truth. And I feel like I should say this up front because it's just not what I would prefer to listen to or to read. I guess you don't really read it. It's not the poetry I would prefer to spend time with. However, as I started to sort through all of those prejudices, I realized that 201, those are exactly the same prejudices that one tends to hear expressed by free verse poets when they are asked to comment on formal poetry. As someone who writes mostly in meter and rhyme, I have heard this over and over and over again from people who write in free verse. Oh, formal verse is corny. It's sing-songy. It's predictable. It's conventional. It's conservative. It's boring. It is unadventurous. I hear all of those things from free verse poets, and I both see where they're coming from and think that they're basically missing the point. And so I guess part of the goal with this episode, for me, is to give, I don't know that I can even say give spoken word a chance because I still don't really like it. I did at James' suggestion, I looked up some spoken word that was okay. Harry Baker is a British spoken word guy it's not my favorite, but he's got some skills. He is able to do some things with words that are difficult to do, that I can't do, and do them with panache. So I even though it's not my flavor of ice cream, I respect it. And I was actually sent back to, I wrote a review a few years ago of Dinesh Smith's book. He had a big book a few years ago. They have had a few books since then. But I wrote a review of Dinesh Smith's book a few years ago, and they're not my favorite poet. I'm fucking up the pronouns. Dinesh Smith goes by they. Dinesh Smith is not my favorite poet. But something I have appreciated about their work is that they go, because they come from a spoken word background, or at least I think it's because they come from a spoken word background, they are interested in entertaining the reader. They're interested in keeping the reader's attention, in putting on a little bit of a show, on being entertaining, on being fun. And boy, that is a quality sorely lacking in a lot of on-the-page, printed, perhaps one might say literary poetry today. So I appreciate that. I appreciate it even more from Nate Marshall, who's another literary academic world poetry person who came out of spoken word. And boy, there is some terrific footage online of Nate Marshall doing spoken word as a teenager. Really good stuff. As I mentioned in the article, in the interview with James, a lot of the spoken word I tend to like best ends up sounding to my ears a whole lot like rap. So Dave Pizarro, who does the Very Bad Wizards podcast, he puts out these. He's a DJ, but not an MC, and so he puts out these records called Beats Without Rhymes. And a lot of spoken word, the best spoken word, the spoken word I tend to like best, sounds to my ears like rhymes without beats, which is to say, it sounds like pretty good rap, and maybe it would even be better if there were a beat. But then again, what the fuck do I know? I'm not a spoken word person. So again, apologies for that. Apologies also for my total ignorance of the business world. James, I should say, would be the first to protest that he does not represent the world of spoken word. He would probably say he doesn't represent anybody but himself. And that's fair. But because he's coming on this podcast, we do end up talking a little bit about spoken word broadly, as well as business shit broadly, because those are maybe my two greatest areas of ignorance in when it comes to his particular world. He is himself relatively new to poetry, or at least he's relatively new to the public poetry world, but he's going about launching a poetry career in what seems to me, and as I talk to him about it, it seems to me the craziest way possible, which is that he's launching a poetry career almost like it's an online business. Including this podcast campaign. I'm a little bit baffled by all of it. If you look at his resume, he basically appears to be, on paper at least, a master of all trades and jack of none. And so, in the end, I remain almost as bewildered by James as I was when I first got that email from Dale. But as I said, he was a very nice guy. We had an enjoyable conversation. And I thought, having spent a lot of time preparing this, spent a fair amount of time editing, compressing this, I kind of have come to the conclusion that I don't really know what to think about any of this, but you at this point, you deserve either my trust or you deserve my disregard. And in either case, I'm going to let you decide what to make of all this. So, to give you a little bit of context for who James is, I have put at the beginning of our interview, I've just plugged right at the very start the audio from one of James's YouTube videos. He releases his poetry primarily as YouTube videos. They're pretty nicely produced. There's a little bit of music. There's some visual effects. I just put the audio to one of those at the very top of our interview, just so you can hear that to begin with and have some sense of the kind of stuff he does. The poem that he performs at the very beginning is called Best or Forgotten. He does bring it up later on in the interview, and it's one that seems, its themes are, I think, pretty relevant to a lot of what we end up talking about. As I said, spoken word is not my thing. I don't really get it. I didn't get it when I started preparing for this interview. I still don't quite get it, but I say, I'll tell you what, I do invite, because I believe that there are at least a couple of spoken word enthusiasts who listen to this show. And if you are listening now, I invite you to write in and let me know if there's somebody I should definitely be interviewing who could really fill me in on spoken word, who could maybe offer a contrast to James, who could right some of the wrong, misrepresentations or the wrong misconceptions that we might give voice to on this podcast, on this episode. Please do let me know. I would love to learn more. I remain skeptical. I remain brimming over with prejudice. With that said, here is my interview with James Nguyen, one of the nicest men I've ever spoken to, and one of the most poised speakers I've ever spoken to. I have listened to, at this point, a shit ton of his interviews on TV, on other podcasts, on YouTube channels, and boy, the man is a professional talker. So that makes one of us. This is James Nguyen. His poetry can be found at JQN Studios on YouTube, and he uses that same handle for Twitter and Instagram, I believe. I'm going to put links to his work also in the show notes. As always, here's my interview with James. At the very beginning is the audio of him performing his poem, Best or Forgotten.
I need to be the best, like literally the best. This isn't in jest or pump up my chest, but genuinely I'm just obsessed to be the best. And this applies to everything. Work, business, reading, the acts of the mind, the acts of the heart. There's just something inside me that won't depart that says I need to be the best. Like literally the best. But really what's beneath it is a focus on hierarchy. I want to be at the top of the field. Not just one, but any field. Why? Why do I need to fly so high that it feels like I'm willing to die? Because the top of the field will yield a shield that can convince me that I'm healed. Because the top of the field gets attention. It's convention that after ascension, people will mention you. Sure, sometimes there's tension about pretension or condescension, but that's not what it's about for me. That's not what I want to do. I don't want to be the best so I can detest the rest. I want to be the best so people will see me. So people will free me from the treadmill of popularity, because I won't need to be popular if I'm the best. People will just see me. See me as someone they admire. Aspire to acquire the fire that's helped me rise higher so they too can retire from the race for attention. Because running after attention is not inspiring, it's tiring. Because there's no expiring of acquiring more status. But here's the thing, when we see the world as zero sum, it's because we're listening to the beat of someone else's drum. Because being the best requires comparison, and comparison precludes people's possible peace from mind. It forces us to always look and find some reference of our own value. And that's behind why I'm stressed to test whether I'm the best. Lest I'm not. Lest I feel the knot in my stomach that's scared to say, what if I'm not? Because who would I be if not the best? How would I define myself? How could I impress myself? But the fact is I'm doing neither. I'm actually suppressing myself, which is depressing myself when I constantly try to win the hierarchy. The hierarchy that doesn't exist outside my mind. I've designed this kind of blind grind that I think is behind mankind because I want to get attention. Because the more attention that I have, the more I'm worthy of attention. The more worthy of attention, the more worthy. The more worthy, the more loved. So really everything that I've said above is misguided by a truth which I've derided and divided myself. But now I've decided and chosen to be guided by my health and address that truth. I don't need to be the best, like literally the best. I just need to be loved by me. I just need to put down this made-up hierarchy.
So for the people who listen to this, mostly the poetry they're going to be used to thinking about, reading, talking about is poetry on the page, sort of literary poetry. So I thought that it might be good both to talk some about your approach with JQN as well as sort of spoken word a little bit more broadly, though I know that's not exclusively how you define what you do. So I took your advice. I watched the Harry Baker video and a couple others of his, and I think he is extremely skillful. Like it's very
fantastic.
And so I watched that. And I watched a number of other spoken word. I have very little background with spoken word, so I tried to give myself a brief intro. It was, I mean, in some ways it was surprising. In others, it was more familiar. It was more like literary poetry than I tend to, literary poetry is a terrible way to describe it, but I'm not sure what a better one is. So yeah, so for people who are more used to reading quiet, dry, boring books or poems and books, how would you characterize spoken word?
I wouldn't, for me, there's not clear rules. There's not clear boundaries around what is and is not spoken word. It's just, there's use of repetition, there's use of rhymes, there's use of musicality, there's use of rhythm. And so even when someone's having a normal conversation and then they start to speak in a certain cadence, like, quote unquote, that could be seen as spoken word poetry in isolation, if that makes sense.
Right,
so
like
for me,
found poetry would be one of the other ways to call that. Yeah. I mean, I think, and a lot of those elements, I think, are present in conventional poetry or literary poetry, however you want to call it. I realized how hard it is to get a brief exposure to a subgenre when I tried to look up on YouTube and Google, and I used a few names that you'd given me or other people have given me as guidelines, but I also just tried to look up what was most popular. And I think if you looked up what was the most popular literary poetry, you'd get a mixed bag as well. So of what I saw, it seemed like the three most important elements were moral instruction, sort of personal authenticity. This is my story. This is where I'm coming from. And then third, and kind of a distant third, was verbal dexterity. It did seem like the most verbally dexterous of it, which was some of my favorite, tended to be a little bit like rap without a beat.
So almost like an a cappella rap. So that's kind of like an urbanized way of speaking about like how it feels to people. Like that's what it comes down to for me. It's just how people feel and experience the actual the poetry.
Yeah. So I guess the things that I'm always a little bit skeptical of moral instruction in art, though there's obviously a huge tradition of it, and it continues to be very, I mean, like there are, dozens of millions of views of a lot of these videos. And I think your work is not a lot. I mean, a lot of the spoken word I found was very, very Christian, and yours, at least that I've listened to, has been pretty secular, unless I've missed it. For a skeptic, for the benefit of a skeptic, what do you think is the value of moral instruction in poetry, or why is that something that should be present, or should it?
Yeah, for me, it's more moral expression, right? And so it's more understanding, okay, what are your values? What do you actually stand for? And then what are really unique ways that you can articulate these, right? And so the ways that I express myself in the world, whether it's, through different activities, my different interactions with people, my choices to choose truth in moments of conflict, whether it's through expression of my actual poetry, whether it's through expression of just my literal, pun unintended here, but literally just speaking to somebody in my spoken word. For me, it's really just different ways that I can articulate the things that I stand for, but it's also even the different ways that I can articulate my points of view. So it's not all my spoken word isn't always about philosophy. It isn't always about spirituality. Like I have a lot of spoken word pieces around business concepts. I have a lot of spoken word pieces, and this is something I'll start to do a lot more next year in terms of commentary around current affairs, commentary around, things that I really like. And so for me, spoken word actually just becomes an extension of my own expression. And why I think that is resonant with people, and why people, catches people's attention, because they don't often see people, nowadays speaking in rhymes or speaking in, spoken word to articulate their points of view. I don't think it's a prerequisite to have moral, quote unquote, instruction in in spoken word pieces or poetry in general or art in general, for me, it's just an expression. And so if someone wants to express their, their values and something they stand for with strong conviction, yeah, do it however by whatever means they feel most resonant with. And for me, spoken word just happens to be that modality for me.
I do think that you're probably right that moral expression is a better way to characterize at least what I've seen in spoken word and what's I think present in your videos as well, because it doesn't seem to be, it's not like these are lessons or truths that are new. It's more like spoken word traditionally is performed in a live room with an audience, though it has a pretty vital life on YouTube as well. And that's your medium is purely video, at least at the moment. But it seems like part of the goal is not so much to teach people as to recite a familiar truth that then sort of people watching feel can affirm. I mean, in a way, it feels like even when it's not Christian, that it has a religious element to it, and that it's a communal embrace of an imperative. We ought to do this. We ought not to do that. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I'd categorize I don't know if I would identify any of my poetry being religious at all, because it's not.
Yeah, no, I don't think the poetry is religious, but it seems like the experience that's implied has something similar to like a communal religious experience that you like. There's I don't know if you ever went to church or went to another kind of service as a kid, or you were. Oh, that's right. Yeah, you were very secular growing up. But there, like part of, at least I was raised Catholic. I'm an atheist now, but part of the tradition is doing having you recite at the beginning of the mass a creed of all the things you believe. And some of the spoken word I've seen feels like it's not that these are new truths. It's more like you're saying something everybody already believes, and saying it aloud in a particular way makes everyone feel connected.
Yeah, I definitely want to differentiate any kind of any particular religious alignment or anything, because I would identify as agnostic.
Yeah.
So yeah, none of my poetry is inclined that way at all. But what I can understand from your point of view, Matthew, is just the idea of I guess a community undertone. Because for me, like, there's actually very few new truths. Like, a lot of the truth,
if any,
if any at all, right? And so for me, like, and that's why I would really differentiate any of my work with any religious association, because and it's interesting because that's actually never been mentioned to me ever before. But what my role, like what I believe the role of, let's say, spoken word poetry, but really it's a broader definition of art for me, is a way of communicating and expressing things that, everybody has subjective truths, but I believe in absolute truths beneath it all, like the idea of like unconditional love being beneath everything. But even if you think about like modern day New York Times bestsellers and a lot of like the nonfiction books that come out now, even a lot of the fiction books, a lot of the concepts that it's based on, like, they've been constant for thousands of years. Thousands and thousands of years. And so whether we trace, a lot of nonfiction books now around like Stoicism, around like other philosophies, like you can trace a lot of these things back to ancient wisdom, right? And so for me, how I really see a lot of written work, or a lot of, let's call it like publications or things that are getting a lot of notoriety these days, like in the last few decades, it's just different ways that you can repackage truths, right? And you even look at more, wider public figures or influencers. You see people like Tony Robbins, or you see people who are quote unquote like life coaches or anything like that. And really what they're repackaging is wisdom that has been like true for thousands and thousands of years. And so really when you see the sorts of books nowadays that are, trending, quote unquote, or are being read a lot, Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, like that was one of the best selling books potentially of all time.
My sister loves that book.
Yeah. And so I remember following Mark Manson's blogs for a long time before he released those. But he quotes, like, he shows the sorts of books that influenced his writing, right? And they go back to ancient philosophy. And so what you really see is just all the truths, they're there. And like, I remember reading reading the books he would recommend about like what influenced his writing. And so you start to tease out these concepts, whether it's from Nietzsche, whether it's from Eric Hoffer, The True Believer, anything like that. And then you start to read his books that he's written, and he has a very unique way of distilling down that knowledge and that, quote unquote wisdom in a way that becomes a lot more accessible, a lot more palatable to the modern reader. And so, Mark Manson really today is, a very famous author from how I see it, because he becomes a really beautiful translator, right? It becomes a very relatable translator. But the actual wisdom, the actual truth that he's speaking about, they're not unique and they're not new. And so when I think about spoken word poetry and, the medium that I am really just growing into now, I see spoken word as the same way. Like, it's another modality that allows me to translate wisdom that has already been true for a very long time. And so it's different ways that I can articulate things that something you mentioned before, Matthew, was, quote unquote, familiar truths. But I think one of the roles that I think art in general play, and what I believe I play with my spoken word, is actually the fact that these truths aren't as familiar nowadays. Because when you really dig down, yeah, they may have been true for a very long time, but the fact that a lot of people don't necessarily embody these truths. In today's society, what I really see is that, there's a lot of quote unquote knowledge and a lot of, let's call it intellectual masturbation, where people can recite things, but how many people have actually embodied these things? And so for me, there is a real role with art, and, my art is spoken word. There's a real role with art to actually express these truths in a different, unique way that allows it to actually land and gives people an opportunity to actually embody these things.
If intellectual masturbation is something you are skeptical of, then you've come to the wrong podcast.
Intellectual sex is much better than masturbation.
So Alain de Botton, who can be really annoying sometimes, but who's also sometimes insightful, I think one of his observations, he's sort of has tried to start this atheist pseudo religion, but one of his observations about it is that we need to be, the thing about like great truths or great ethical wisdom is that it's not enough to learn it once. You have to learn it again and again and again. What I'm curious about though is as you said, it's not that there are any like new truths that are being dug up by spoken word, but what people are in need of is not to be exposed to them at all, but rather to be exposed to them in a way that helps them embody them. Rather than simply knowing the words for them. But I guess then what I'm still skeptical of is like, so even if poetry is not giving people a new piece of wisdom exactly, there is still an expectation that poetry will sort of help people be better people. Do you think that's true?
Maybe it's a rabbit hole we don't necessarily have to go down, but like, what is better? Like, better assumes you're not good enough right now, right? And so,
hold on. But you just said like that the truth, but you don't embody it, and presumably embodying it would be better, right?
Yeah, for me, it's actually just remembering the truth that's always been there.
You're not Platonic, you're Socratic. That's
yeah.
You said you all right, okay. So yeah. Sorry. But you want to remember it rather than just know it. You want to bring it into your life.
It's not about things to add; it's about things to subtract. And so for me, like what the role poetry actually plays is allowing to cut through a lot of the noise that gets in the way and I actually see as distractions. And so to your quote before around Alain de Botton, around wisdom needing to be learned multiple times, like I would actually disagree with the premise there, because for me, if you learn it, you only need to learn it once. So maybe you have to hear it multiple times before you learn it, right? Because if you've actually learned a lesson, then you've embodied it. And if you've embodied it, then you're actually living it.
That's okay. That's fascinating. I mean, what you're saying then is that if you've really learned something, if you've really learned a truth, then you don't need to learn it again. You've embodied it. It has become part of you. But that seems like, in that case, I feel like either I've never learned anything or that can't be true, because no matter what I've learned, I've still gone on to fuck up in that. Like I've still gone on like not to embody it, even if I thought I learned it once. So how do you experience that? Do you actually learn things and then truly embody them forever?
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I'm not painting myself as like this, perfectionist and this, somebody that's unattainable and doesn't like parts of me don't feel certain ways and all this stuff. But for me, it's really around a humility piece around, what is it to actually learn something? Everybody goes out and says, here's all the lessons I've learned, this, that, and the other. But how much of that is actually virtue signaling? How much of that is actually just saying, oh yeah, because, for the majority of people, if you can intellectually articulate something and, and recite it, most people might, like for a lot of parts of them, it might be really, might be intimidating, because they might be like, that sounds really articulate. That sounds like that's right. I'm just going to assume and I'm going to accept the premise that you have learned that lesson. What happens if they haven't learned the lesson? They've just learned how to regurgitate it. For me, it's not even about learning. It's about remembering, because, and again, this assertion I come to at the very start is beneath everything, the wisdom that we're all looking for is actually already in us. And so when you quote unquote embody something, it's actually you're just remembering it was already there, and you have that felt visceral experience of what that feels like inside you. That's my position, at least.
Yeah, no, I mean that seems like very consistent with sort of ancient wisdom. You have a very high bar to establish that you've learned something, which I certainly can't gainsay that. What I'm curious about, though, because I've listened to a number of interviews and I've watched the videos that I've been able to of your poetry that's either online or that your team shared with me, and seen some other interviews with you, and the way I've heard you talk about poetry, at least, is very. Democratic is a sort of too stuffy a term for it, but you have a very you have.
People are going to imagine I'm writing like poetry around politics and everything.
No, right, yeah. So that's not what I mean. But it's very egalitarian. Your approach to ethics is like extremely severe and demanding, which I respect. But then your approach to like aesthetics is much more loosey goosey. I have some questions like more specifically about your work and your poetry, but then I'm also curious, like, what makes a poem good? Like, do you think can you say that a poem is good or bad? Or like a poem succeeds or fails, or is better or worse? Because it seems like you're really resistant to those kind of terms.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Because all of those things are just value judgments, right? And so, yeah, all of those things are value judgments. Yeah. It goes down the rabbit hole of what is art, and art being like a hugely subjective domain and all of that stuff. Sure. But it's like, it's up to everybody to define, the reason they write poetry, or the reason they like, even if someone's listening to my poetry, right? For them to say it's good and bad requires some level of an expectation of what they believe it should or should not be.
Sure.
And so without them really knowing my intention, then they have to project or predict or presume some level of intention behind why I'm writing things. The reality is nobody ever really knows, except for me, why I'm actually writing these things. So for someone to evaluate it as good as bad, or good or bad, whether they evaluate it based on what they see as like more widely accepted criteria for popularity. Maybe they conflate popularity with success, right? Maybe they conflate awareness with success. Maybe they conflate musicality with success, or whatever criteria they evaluate it on. But for me, and this potentially feeds into a little bit more of more my spiritual disposition around poetry and art. For me, the poems that I'm most proud of, let's say, and whether you want to use that as a barometer or a definition of how I see a successful poem, the ones that are most expressive and authentic and aligned with who I believe I am and who I believe, it's the place from which those poems are actually written. Well, for me, it's just like how authentically is it expressing what I'm trying to say, right? And so that for me is a successful poem. If it really resonates with a wider demographic and it goes quote unquote viral and a ton of people watch it, like, great. But like, if we really strip it all back, like to presume something is a good or a bad poem, it comes back to the duality that is an illusion that is created by saying something's good. Because to say something's good, you assume something's bad. And to say, and so that's a false dichotomy, because what if it was exactly as it is?
Right. No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So if it truly is just an expression of our soul, which I assert is what creativity really is when we're in a deep flow state, whether that's poetry, whether that's paintings, whether that's sculptures, whether that's dancing, whatever it might be. If you accept that premise, Matthew, that at our very, very core, like it's the creativity that is flowing through us is, our connection with, whether you want to call it source, whether you want to call it, the universe, whether you want to call it just a deep flow state. Again, it's just semantics. But if you accept that as the premise of what, deeply creative works of quote unquote art are, then there's really nowhere else to really evaluate its quote unquote success other than its alignment with authenticity.
Okay, so I think what's definitely true is that if a poem, that it's impossible to say whether or not someone else's poem succeeded according to that person's intentions. right? That the poet is the only person who can really be an authority on that question. I totally am with you there, but it seems like there are two possibilities. Like one is that either poetry or art is this sort of pure expression of one's essential being,
Yep.
or that art is maybe some of that along with craft and skill and convention and luck.
How would you define art?
Oh, I mean, I think that definitely the artist's, essential self has to be there somewhere. I mean, without that, it feels like the stakes are too low, or there's nobody's on the hook. It doesn't matter. It's not really going to connect with anyone else. That said, there are plenty of like really good people who are terrible poets, and really like who are like beautiful selves and terrible poets. Or alternatively, like maybe there are people who can really authentically express themselves through poetry, but it's not very appealing in the same way that like you have a favorite movie, right? And there are movies that you don't like as much, I assume.
Yeah. Yeah.
So some of those are better. And some of those, I mean, like probably the best of them really do have something of the director and the writer and the actors, some essential expression that's really authentically in there. But there's also a bunch of other stuff that has to be there. Because if it's not, then, I could show you some student films that you would fucking hate, that are really authentic. So that doesn't seem like, to me, it feels like I love poetry too much to abandon it to like mere therapy and expression. Therapy's fine, but like
totally.
Also there's like I totally think they're better and worse poems.
Yeah, for sure. And what I just find super interesting about that is beneath it all is a level of subjectivity. Because a poem, you might say, James, this is the best poem. I might read it and just not resonate with it.
Sure.
Which is, and this is more interesting as people just get more into the public spotlight, and definitely with social media and the internet now. Like,
sorry, I missed one of the words you said. As people get into
more of the spotlight, right?
Oh, the spotlight.
So,
okay, yeah.
When they get more notoriety, and then it just feels, because the internet just allows you to get feedback, let's say in a diplomatic way, just get feedback from millions and millions and millions of people, where previously you just were never able to do that, right? The 150 cap, I think it's Dunbar's number, where previously
what does that mean?
I'm pretty sure it's Dunbar's number, but like previously, like our brains in our communities, we only were wired, like neurologically, we're only wired to be able to socialize and interact and really properly know about a tribe of about 150 people.
Okay.
And so like that's physiologically how we evolved. And so now with social media, it's like thousands in terms of someone's say Facebook feeds, but then realistically, once you start to get to a position of public, let's call it just public awareness, or social media quote unquote fandom or celebritydom, then you're talking about millions of people interacting with you, right? And so your brain just can't really process any of this feedback, because whether it's positive or negative, your dopamine receptors are just being hijacked like over and over and over again. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is the whole idea of something being good or bad. Like at the end of the day, yeah, you could show me something that you absolutely love, and with all respect, I may have a completely different view of that. And so yeah, it is really interesting when people start to think about, what is a good and bad poem, what's a good and bad, piece of art or anything like that. And, when I really just strip everything back, it's like, it's almost this weird paradox, because in one hand, like we all live by ourselves, because the only person we ever go to sleep with is our own mind, right? You go to bed with yourself. Even if you're sleeping next to your partner, you go to bed with yourself and you wake up with yourself. But then the flip side of that paradox is that we're also always connected in a community. And so, it is a natural disposition to be seeking some form of, let's call it, validation, but really it's just, it's some sort of affirmation that you're still accepted in a tribe, because otherwise, ancestrally, then there is a evolutionary fear of rejection, because it meant death back in the savannah. So it's kind of weighing those two things. But from a philosophical level, when I really step back from it, it's like, yeah, I'm writing poetry because that's just what's flowing through me. If that happens to resonate with a high number of people, great. That like what I'm speaking or what I'm communicating, or other artists talk about channeling something or whatever it might be. Well, it's actually speaking through me may resonate with a lot of people because that may actually be from what is really pure inside me, right? And it's not filtered based on, all these other biases and all these other prejudices. But if the answer is, I truly believe that I'm connected to my deepest authentic self, and that's the place from which I'm writing these poems, and it doesn't resonate with a huge ton of people, millions of people. Well, my question, not even just yourself, Matthew, is really to anybody's psyche that then has some level of dissonance of whether they've actually achieved quote unquote material success or not. It's to really ask the question of why they believe that is necessary. Because, there may be people that aesthetically, people might be like, oh, they're just beautiful. And yeah, there's the scientific symmetry of face proportions and all this stuff, right? So yeah, there are people that just look absolutely gorgeous, but somebody might find somebody else really attractive, and somebody else may not share that opinion, but does that make that person any less attractive? Because if a piece of art is written and it's really deeply authentic and expressive to the artist, but nobody necessarily shares that same expression, well, is that really art? And that's the question I would love to tease out with you.
Oh, I mean, and that's actually, I think that's a question I'm constantly asking about literary poetry as well. I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but beholders often cluster in their opinions. Some beholders are outliers, but what I try never to do is to quarrel with someone who genuinely loves a piece of art, even if I think it has no value to me. If you genuinely love,
why is that the case? I would love to ask the question, why do you do that?
Because I'm not interested in arguing with anybody's pleasure. What I am interested in often is getting some kind of account of that, right? I think this is part of the difficulty of criticism is, for some people, criticism, if you are somebody whose name carries a certain weight, then maybe your thumbs up, thumbs down is enough. If you're Warren Buffett, maybe all people need to know is whether you're for it or not. But yeah, I think for my purposes, good criticism doesn't just render a judgment, it relates an experience. It helps the reader see what the critic saw that had value, or see what the critic saw that maybe was a flaw. The problem, I think, is that very often the work that people say they admire, they often won't bother to say they enjoy it, but they'll say they admire it, or they will promote it, or they will disseminate it. That work is not the work that they actually enjoy. I mean, I think part of this is because literary poetry has been kind of removed from, all these fucking, market is a horrible word for it, but literary poetry has been removed from the condition in which it has to respond immediately to audience experience. And so I think the criteria by which it gets promoted, tend to become less and less about anybody's actual pleasure. So yeah. I will not say, you like this poem, fuck you, you're wrong. What I will say is, lots of people are promoting this particular work. I don't see what's good about it. Does anyone else?
Yeah.
Can anyone chime in and explain what's there? Because I don't see it. And I think often there's nothing there. Sorry, go ahead.
It's like a movie. It's I don't like that movie. Oh, you do? Why? And it doesn't have to come from, a castigative tone. You're not necessarily trying to be too confrontational or anything. It might just be oh, I'm just trying to understand it. And so, when I really strip back, whether it's spoken word, whether it's, literary poems, poetry, whether it's, books, anything like that, it's well, what's the intention behind all of those things, right? Because some people may be writing, say journalists, right? Maybe for them, it's a less of, an artistic expression. Some, journalists and features may be. Some of them may just be reporting news. And they're oh, my role and my responsibility, my intention here is to write it in a way that as many people as possible can get the message that I think is really valuable and really necessary for a lot of people to hear. So then it just becomes around intentionality. And so, what I find really fascinating and what I'm increasingly leaning more into is spoken word as my modality of communication. Because there are times where I'm going to communicate where I just want to be expressive. And there's times where I want to communicate where I'm actually trying to communicate for the audience as a way to convey a message that I think is really necessary to hear.
this is something we talked about before, a little bit in our earlier earlier conversation, that I find fascinating, and also I'm super skeptical of, because there's a great deal of precedent for this. Like Lucretius, wrote the nature of things, that he said his message was bitter as wormwood, but his verse was sweet as honey, and so the goal was to kind of ease the spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And then I even think of, like, in the WPA had the living newspaper. It was like a government funded theater project where they would enact newspaper stories to kind of bring the news to a popular audience. And so what you're suggesting is that spoken word can just be a vehicle for, not even like more like verse than poetry, like just a means of communication. And that seems, again, like historically there's totally precedent for that, but it seems like, I find it like, it just seems hard to figure out like how you would contextualize that so as not to seem hokey.
Yeah. So for me, just elaborate on what you would assume is the definition of hokey.
There I have, I'm going to pull a James and say, I don't have a good,
that we're already there. It's a James.
We're there. Yeah. It's done. I don't have a good definition, but I think a lot of people have a feeling that they recognize when they see something and they say, that's a little hokey. So I think whatever you want to call it, I think that I find it hard to imagine the context in which you could deliver, say, the news or economic principles or whatever kind of message you want in spoken word in a non-coffee house setting, and not like have people raising eyebrows or laughing or ignoring it.
Yep. So really good points. And so that was true with anything that was, I wouldn't say it's innovation, because it's not. As you said, there's like a lot of ancient precedent for verse being used as a modality of communication. But, until something exists, it always seems crazy, right?
Okay, fair.
True. Before there's any genre of new music, whether we talk about hip hop, whether we talk about rap, whether we talk about reggae, whether we talk whatever, like before it was mainstream, it was odd because it was the minority at the time, right? And so for me, I'm like, okay, cool. Like I totally concede that it's unfamiliar because it doesn't exist right now. But on the flip side of that, that's also why it's wildly exciting for me, because it doesn't exist right now. And, I know the modes of communication that I'm used to. I've spoken it because, in another life, I've done the business game a lot. So I've done a lot of keynotes, I've done a lot of conferences, I've done a lot of public speaking. And so, I know the sorts of messages I can communicate that way. I've also, done a lot of writing in a lot of mainstream publications, and my writing's been, featured widely. Sorry, I keep mixing those two words up. So I also know what resonates in terms of that. And I know what I can communicate when it comes to just like a written word. But then I'm like, okay, great. There's a lot of speakers, there's a lot of writers, there's like brilliant writers, brilliant journalists, brilliant, keynote public speakers, all of this stuff. But there's also a level of cut through that comes from uniqueness and authenticity. And, I'm just betting with my feet at the end of the day. Like, it's my reputational risk that I'm putting out there. And it's like, okay, if you also accept that reputation in and of itself is the illusion of the identity, then you're not really losing anything anyway, because it just becomes expression, and everything is just expression. And so for me, right now, potentially it seems very unfamiliar, very unorthodox. The idea outside, whether it's a coffee store kind of setting, or whether it's, a book reading or anything like that. But what happens when that changes? What happens when people actually want to listen to something that is actually engaging and exciting? Because when we start to deconstruct the attention economy, and we look at how people are actually consuming content now, and we actually see that there is a startling fragmentation of our attention span. And when you start to think about, the different, let's call it channels, different platforms that are springing up, TikTok, Clubhouse even is a longer form, but, social media, like Instagram and Twitter, you just start to see a trend towards something that is becoming increasingly shorter in terms of the attention span. And so when you really start to look at that, well, the shorter the attention span, the more powerful the cut through needs to be. And so what is your point of difference when you're just like a speaker? What's your point of difference when you're just, a writer? What's your point of difference when in 5 seconds, I can actually recite a rhyme that is pithy and also profound at the same time. Well, like in the same way, the reason quotes are remembered, well, really profound quotes, even though they're really pithy, is because good explanations have exponential reach, right? And so it's kind of the half-life of a really good quote. Yeah, it can be increased by how clever the compression is, because a 5-word quote can be remembered for so long. Well, what happens when, different messages, whether it's around current affairs, whether it's around, first principles or mental models or whatever, people might be interested in, those happen to be my interests. What happens when I can communicate those in 5 seconds in a way that people actually want to remember, because it's a hook, because people they just resonate with it. Right. And my assertion is just the expression that's coming through me and what I'm writing is just more resonant. Like the truths, potentially 10, 20, 100, 1,000 people can write the same truths. And we've seen that, right? But the reason why people will actually resonate and people remember, people will share, people will listen to the spoken word that I'm creating, or just in general, I assert just expressive art, is because, I'm going to say things in ways that other people aren't saying them. And so it's actually really exciting for me that something like this doesn't exist right now.
I'm such a fucking idiot, because you're right. Basically what you're saying is the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, and they laughed at Jesus too. And if you think of the OJ trial, it's the only sentence anybody remembers from that verbatim is, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. So you're definitely right that if it works, it's going to work, and it's going to seem strange until it does. So you're, in addition to being maybe the least flappable person I've ever spoken to, you also are pretty, I think you're not at all belligerent, but you did sort of say that maybe poets or artists have neglected certain imperatives that you're at least trying to pursue, or you're trying to live out your own life and work by. One being that an artist has an obligation to promote himself, to self-propagate, to get the work. It's not enough to make the work, you have to get the work out there. That's part of being an artist. And then the other one being that the market of attention is the most viable, if not always the best way to measure artistic success. Is that fair? Is that a fair paraphrase?
Yeah, semantically, there's a few things I'd like.
Please, yeah.
I want to touch on, just the idea of success and everything. But for me, whether it's, there's a few things. So the first thing is, I believe it's actually, you take it one step back. It's even before the promotion of art, it's the creation of art. Right. And so what I believe every artist, and I actually assert everybody's an artist, they just need to find their modality, an artistic form. Like for me, business is actually quite an artistic form, right?
Because what? Business is an art form?
You see an industry as a blank canvas, right? And something that doesn't exist in that industry. My background's been in tech. So, something that doesn't yet exist. And I'm not talking about business, the pure capitalist drive and just trying to make money. But I'm talking about building a business, building a technology, building a solution that doesn't yet exist. That's deeply creative, because the industry in and of itself, the market, is a blank canvas. And then in the same way,
that's like an invention, right?
Yeah. But what's business then? Then I would question the assumption of, and the definition of.
But business is an enterprise designed to make money. Businesses fail or succeed based on whether they make money. Businesses are often attached to a new invention that solves a problem in a creative way. And invention is totally, obviously, almost by definition, involves creativity and maybe art. But businesses do succeed or fail. There is a measure for how they succeed or fail, right? Which is money.
Yes. Yeah. So say you come up with really groundbreaking technology. It could be, anything. It could be related to AI. It could be related to blockchain. Again, that's just showing my prejudice and
your background.
My filter bubble. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
But whatever it might be, right? I'm involved in an organization, it's real innovation in terms of, technology around consciousness and all these different things, right? So say we accept the premise around technology and innovation, right? So if you just create an invention or you just innovate something, well, if that doesn't get, again, back to the tree falling in the woods, if that doesn't get to anybody, then for me, that's a real disservice to the community. That's a real disservice to, the people or the organizations or whoever you've built this innovation for, or you've invented this for. That's a real disservice to them if that can't get into their hands. So then what's the next step? Well, how do you actually map out the next steps of actually how to get that to market? How do you actually, quote unquote, build a brand, build like the marketing aspects of it? How do you then create business models to make it viable? All of that actually becomes deeply creative. Like one of my friends, I can't take credit for this analogy, but he thinks about it as similar to cooking. Say there's different ingredients, right? And you can have, a masterful chef who, say is a Michelin star chef, who you give him or her, eggs, butter, a whisk, or whatever it might be, and they're going to make a totally different, batch of scrambled eggs compared to, somebody who's just cooking on the weekends, right? And so the ingredients, then it becomes an actual area of creativity for how you use those ingredients to create the end product. The same thing I believe is true in business, because, for me, I actually extend the definition of business to innovation as well, because I find that deeply creative and I like innovating and creating new technologies, however you want to define technologies. But, the layer on top of that is like, okay, once you've done that, well, how do you actually get that in the hands of the people that and this actually feeds into your question, Matthew, around, my thoughts on art. But then how do you actually get this, let's call it the base level of technology or innovation as a form of art, right? If we accept that there's an area of creativity there, and we accept that, creativity is a precursor to art, then we can say that, an innovation in and of itself can be artistic. Right. And so, if say, whether it's Einstein, whether it's Edison, whether it's Tesla, whether it's all these historic inventors, if they didn't do what they did, then we wouldn't be living the lives that we do. And so if we accept that they had a responsibility first and foremost to channel their creativity and their unique expression to something that can move our humanity forwards and our civilization forwards, then I really take a step back and I see the same thing in terms of any form of artistic expression, right? So whether it's spoken word, whether it's, written poetry, whether it's, fiction, creative novels, whether it's, dancing, whether it's, any form of creativity in that sense. For me, I actually believe there's a mandate to create, right? I believe there's a mandate to channel that creativity. And that's, mandate
on whom? A mandate on everybody? Mandate, what does that mean?
On the artist.
But you said everybody's an artist.
Yeah, so it would be everybody. Yeah, once they found their medium of artistic expression, I actually believe it's a real disservice to everybody if their unique creative expression isn't channeled. And so that's what I was actually speaking about. Not necessarily like, yes, once you actually have it out, then there's the next layer of creativity where it's like, oh, you have a responsibility to get that to as many people as possible if you can powerfully help people. But it's not necessarily to say that, the market in and of itself is the sole determinant of your success. For me, it's like, how authentically have you expressed yourself? And generally speaking, getting it to the market is going to give you that level of feedback, not to determine your success in terms of how artistic or creative you've been in terms of your expression, but it will determine your success in terms of how many people it can actually impact.
Okay. So I think I follow the, I do still think like everybody's an artist is like saying everything's political, like the word begins to lose its meaning. But if you, the distinction I think I do that makes sense to me is that you're saying the market of attention, which again, this is a terrible way to describe it, but seeing how people respond to things, whether it's on social media or elsewhere, that's not a great way to determine whether you have authentically expressed yourself, which I think like that's a pretty intuitive observation. I think like most people would be with you there, but it is a good way to get a sense of whether what you have said or what you have put out there can help people.
At least resonate with people. Yeah.
And right. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't help them, but at least it does something to them.
Yeah, that's right. Whether they resonate with it, and then the precursor to actually being able to impact the change would be a level of resonance with the message.
Where I think I'm really with you is I tend to think that because we have such a glut of the horrible word we now all use content in our culture. I do think
see your body literally shook as you said that.
I have to gag a little bit to get it out. I do think that like the Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, Vincent van Gogh model of like being ignored until you're dead, I think that's going to be less and less of a meaningful possibility. I think we're going to see fewer and fewer people really emerge if they did not emerge in some capacity when they're alive. Artists, I mean, because I think we're such an absolute flood
I
that
agree with that.
things will be washed under. So I do think that like while like Nikola Tesla's obscurity doesn't mean he was any less of a scientist, just because he was not as good of a businessman as say Edison, it doesn't. I don't know what I think about saying the artist has an obligation to self-promote, but maybe
So I would say
at this point, nobody else, it's not going to happen otherwise.
Yeah, if people are creating just for their own expression, and that's it, okay. If they're happy just expressing and looking at their painting or reading their own poetry, fine. But if they're creating because they believe that what is being channeled through them, what their expression can tangibly impact other people, like the sorts of poetry I write, having gone through my own mental health challenges, having gone through my own, like really trying times in my life, like some of my poems around, entrepreneurship and around that being futile, and around, a quest to be the best, like best of forgotten is actually one of my poems. Yeah. Around the more inner work I've done, is the more I realized I just like climbed hierarchies to be seen rather than climb hierarchies, for any sense of actual fulfillment. But it's like messages like that, I believe are going to be really resonant with other people who are on that endless treadmill, who are pursuing entrepreneurship for just that reason, or pursuing, achievements and accolades and external validation for just that reason. And, for me, I believe I have a mandate, therefore, to communicate that and get that to as many quote unquote, high achievers, entrepreneurs, high performers that also share a similar story, because that's my way. And that's the beauty of the internet now, is the scalability of the message, but really beyond the message is the scalability of that level of empathy. Because, going through those times, I would have really been able, and I've also had, I'm a big fan of Will Smith's philosophies, actually. And like growing up, I would watch
of what?
Will Smith.
Oh, Will Smith. Oh, the actor. Okay.
Yeah, the actor.
Yeah.
A lot of his philosophies growing up. And I remember just watching a lot of his interviews on YouTube a lot. And just a lot of his quotes really resonated with me at the time. And so, that ability to feel like somebody understood me, to literally feel that level of empathy from somebody outside anybody in my immediate circle, like that was really powerful for me in really important times in my life and in proper inflection points in my life. And so my poetry being another way that I can, almost pay that forward, almost communicate and show people a level of empathy, at scale, when they can actually listen and experience my poetry and experience the same lessons that I've learned. Like back to the start of our conversation, maybe that might not allow them to learn the lesson, but it will give them the opportunity to at least see or get, Alain de Botton's quote, just being given another opportunity to at least hear the lesson.
I'm curious about a few things. First, I realized as I was preparing for this interview that we have a common burden, you and I, which is that James Nguyen, and I know I'm not quite pronouncing that correctly, but would you say it one time so that everyone can hear it correctly, please?
Yeah, James Nguyen.
So James Nguyen and Matthew Smith are exceedingly common names, incredibly hard to nail down on Google. So when I published my first book, I had to come up with something, so I threw my middle name in there to distinguish it. And you, in your poetry publishing life, you publish as JQN, or on YouTube, it's JQN Studios. And I think that's also on Instagram and Twitter or some other places, just as a way to distinguish from the millions of other James Nguyen's. So my heart goes out to you there. I feel your pain there. I definitely have had a similar experience. I'm curious. So you referred a couple times to in another interview I heard, and then in our conversation, to this book, The Second Mountain by David Brooks. I've not read it, but my understanding of it is that it's sort of a book about people who have achieved worldly success, but then still have a lot of life left and want to do something more with it. And then sort of what's the second mountain to climb? What's the second, great goal to achieve? And in your case, at least part of this has to do with a kind of a rhetorical public service through poetry. What I'm curious about, though, is that it seems like you talk about your poetry in one hand as a sort of a pure self-expression, that what really matters is that you're just sort of authentically being into words and allowing that to come out unfiltered. But if it's also for public consumption and not just, and like public consumption in a way that you're hoping to do people good, do you revise? Do you, and if so, how? Like, what are the criteria you use in determining whether or not your work is good enough yet, even if you and I are always going to disagree on, goodness and badness of poetry?
Yeah, totally. Just quickly on Second Mountain by David Brooks. Like the whole crux of that book is, the first mountain is the one you climb based on, what you believe you're supposed to, right? And so, whether it's material success, whether it's, you try to become a professional athlete or, start a family at a certain time or anything like that. And then for those who are lucky enough to get to the top of that mountain, realize that, it's actually super unfulfilling. And what Brooks actually asserts is that the second mountain, the one that is the one that's worth climbing, is the one actually around service. It's around community. It's around contribution. And so, that's why I really deeply align with it, because, a lot of my friends as well who have reached, their first mountain. And again, that's all subjective in and of itself too, and relative,
Sure.
what everybody sets their first mountain as. But they also have come to a similar understanding, right? Or similar conviction, where they're like, oh, it actually is around service. It's actually around how we can give back, right? Instead of first mountain always being about like climbing and not quite taking, but it's all around building something for ourselves. The second mountain's around giving back and building something for the people around us and for our communities, right? So that is something I'm really resonant with. In terms of my writing process, which is a bit of a tangent.
And revision. Do you want revision?
Revision.
What? Because there's some point. What do you say? Is this good or bad or good enough, or is there some criteria?
Yeah, absolutely. As a writer, like you would know as well, Matthew, it's like 80% of the fine tuning. Well, from my experience previously when writing, comes in the editing, right? And so really how I go about these, like a lot of my poems, some actually are first takes. And they just flow through, and then I read them back and I'm like, oh, that actually, I don't feel compelled to make any edits. But then when I'm working on especially longer pieces, or, I'm working on pieces that I just feel like have a lot of density to it and I can't do it in one sitting. Yeah, there is going to be a lot of revision. And so in my editing and revision process, it's really around, it's almost like the self-performance. So how this actually, even when I was writing, a lot of it would be speaking out loud for the prose to make sure that it actually sounded right. And these are back when I'm writing essays and articles and stuff. But with my spoken word, I'm performing it out loud to myself and I'm experiencing the words myself. Yeah. So in terms of the editing process, especially for longer poems that are a lot more dense and I can't do them in one sitting. What I'll do is, and this is the whole revision process anyway, I'm performing my poems back to myself, right? And the things I'm looking out for are the rhythm, the musicality, even the rhyming couplets. Are they the best word choices that I could use there, right? So I was even writing a poem around teenage mental health, because that's something that's more grade day by day is actually one of the lines. But yeah, even like certain words that, like a rhyming couplet I was using was suppression and obsession. And like, it's just choosing those right words that I might revise later and be like, oh, I think I could actually rhyme a better word here. And so that's when I'm kind of, that's my revision process really. And it's also like, am I communicating the message that I'm trying to share, right? So the whole expressive download, let's say, and just like, the brain dump, the first draft, it's actually, the revision process is no different. And I don't know how other writers do it, but for me, like when I was writing, especially long form essays, sometimes I would actually turn off my screen and just write, because one of the sayings I really love is there's no such thing as writer's block. There's just self-judgment. And so when I would be able to just sit with that part of me that would be judging what I'm writing, then I would just literally just write. And this is back when I'm writing essays. So I find that self-judgment to be less vocal now. That part of me that judges my own writing to be less vocal in my spoken word. But when I'm reading it back, it's not like I'm judging and being like, oh, that was an awful line that I wrote. I'm like, oh, that just doesn't sound right. Like if I'm putting myself in the position of the listener and I'm like, oh, I don't actually feel that in the same way when I was writing it, the message isn't communicated as much. And so, in some ways, I will play my own listener and I'll be writing for myself as the listener. So in both ways, it's still an expression of my authenticity, but like sometimes you just need to step back from the painting to see how it looks on a slightly more macro level.
Yeah, that makes. I mean, that makes sense. It's intuitive. I at some point I would, if we were talking forever, I would want to put more pressure on the question of what sounds good or bad, or even like whether there's such a thing as an acquired taste, because it seems like the wanting simply to gauge all art, all artistic, all aesthetic response by kind of what resonates with it with the poet versus what resonates with the listener. I'm skeptical. I guess I just think there's a little bit more scaffolding in there than mere intuitive response.
Yeah, there's definitely more nuance as well. Yeah, there's more nuance, but there's a level of intuition as well, and it's just how I write. And in the same way, like if you draw kind of analogies with jazz musicians or any muso, like they may take inspiration from different genres and then meld it together to create what's really unique to them, right? And somebody who really likes rock but also may like jazz may create something that's deeply unique. Somebody who may like reggae and may like soul, right? And so it's not to say one's right or wrong, but that just creates the unique intersection, the unique expression that is the authentic artist. And so for me, that's what it is. Because I take a lot of inspiration as well from my taste in music. And so the sorts of music that I like actually informs subconsciously, like forms the sort of musicality that I include in my poetry, right? And so if I'm personally not into like heavy metal or hard rock or anything, but if I was, I would actually assert my poems would sound very different. Like I'm a lot more into R&B, I'm a lot more into soul and that sort of genre, and a lot of acoustic music. And so like that informs a lot of my poetry. And so even watching it back, like I can feel the musicality of my musical inspiration through what I write. And I know that would be different for a different poet if they were writing the same sort of spoken word, if they liked different musical genres, for instance.
Yeah. Oh no, that certainly seems true. And what I've gathered about you about your literary sensibilities, because most of the books you've referred to in our two conversations were either philosophical or self-help books. And what I gather is that for you, just as when we say publish, this is really putting out video and audio rather than printed words. It seems like for you you take in work mostly auditorially rather than like you don't seem like you're as much a big reader of poetry as you are a listener to lyrics. Is that fair?
Yeah, in terms of spoken word, yes. Yeah. Like
is there other stuffy top collar button poetry that you do read on the page?
Yeah, I wouldn't say as much. Like I've read Shakespeare. I've gone into a lot of sonnets, a lot of love poems. I think one of the books, the name escapes me, but it's not even just around poetry, right? Like I'm a big reader. In a previous life, I was reading a lot, right? But in terms of now, what really informs a lot of my writing and creativity is more the different modalities. So it is like auditory. I would listen to a lot of the music will inform what I write. A lot of the conversations I'll have, a lot of the speeches I'll listen to, like that probably informs a lot more of my creativity now than the written word. But it's also especially in word choices, I love writers who just have beautiful, beautiful command of the English language. Like I'm in such admiration, especially when, previously I was doing a lot of written writing on the page, right? And a lot of articles and essays and a lot of those things. And so, I have a deep place in my heart for those times in my life. But I would say in terms of what I identify with more now, even my poetry, when I write it, my preference when I'm sharing it with people is for them to hear me perform it rather than to read it.
That seems essential. And with spoken word, as with rap, the vocals are part of it would be like reading song lyrics. The vocals are part of the art form. That totally makes sense. I had one last kind of somewhat shapeless question that maybe you can help me put a shape to. Whenever we're comparing ourselves to what's already out there, I think there's almost certainly somebody wiser than you. There's almost certainly someone whose sort of personal story is more objectively extraordinary than yours. There's almost certainly someone who's more verbally dexterous than you, and that's certainly my experience. And it seems like with the spoken word, it's like, again, spoken word is not exactly my cup of tea. I wasn't sure what to expect with your poetry, and then when I went and watched and listened to more, I realized it was more of a piece with some of the stuff out there than I'd expected. But when I thought about what I've learned about you, it seems like where you seem to have a really strong edge that really distinguishes you is that you're one of the most fluent and versatile talkers I've encountered. But in the dialogue I've been reading, the Gorgias, he offers this definition that just really stuck in my mind. I couldn't get it out of my head. So he's talking about oratory, and he offers this definition of orator. Because like at this point, I've listened to and heard you give talks on various television stations or on podcasts or various other places on tax policy, on cryptocurrency, on starting a small business, on designing apps, on creating viral video content, on achieving emotional growth, and on lots and lots hours on poetry. And it came to mind. So Socrates, who's like maybe never more annoying than he is in this particular dialogue, I have to say, like I'm less sympathetic to his point of view in this dialogue than I am to in most of the others that I've read. But he offers this definition of an orator. He says the great orator, the best orator, is someone who can persuade a crowd that he is an expert in any given field better than an expert in that field.
Yeah, for me, the art of, say, communication, right, has just been something I guess I've honed over a really, really long period of time. So, back even in high school, I was, doing a lot of public speeches. I was traveling internationally for debating, and I was doing a lot of that stuff. And so it's just the background that, let's say the 10,000 hour rule by Malcolm Gladwell. I've just had my 10,000 hours doing it. But, I'm also like, I'm deeply curious around a number of different fields. Like I have an eclectic set of interests, right? And so, as an extension of that, whether it's through reading a lot, whether it's through writing about a lot of different topics, I'm just in and around words all the time. And so, the ability to communicate through words, and now definitely through like spoken words. I've always been speaking for a very long time, right? I think there's a real, and it's kind of the adage of with great power comes great responsibility, because there's definitely an ability to communicate very dense ideas. And so, Richmond Feynman, someone I really admire and has inspired and informed a lot of my thinking over the years as well. There's the Feynman technique, which is essentially, if you can't explain something to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, then you don't really know that concept well enough. And, I really like to flex and flow between the two. This has been just a fucking fun conversation, Matthew, because it really allows me to go and really pursue and satiate my intellectual curiosity in areas where we can just have a really expansive conversation. Yeah. But in the same way, I think, a lot of, whether you call it an orator, whether you call it, somebody who's a great speaker, great with words, my real mark of intelligence is being able to, have a conversation of this caliber, where we're speaking around really esoteric and really abstract concepts, but then also being able to summarize the conversation we had to a 10-year-old and being able to distill it down to really simple terms.
I'll let you do that, because I don't know that I could.
Maybe I can write a poem about it. Maybe that's my way of doing it. But for me, that's also, what really informs a lot of my poetry. Because the idea that, a complex idea, something that, that can be really, really dense, that can be really abstract, can be really esoteric, can then be actually accessed and accessed, and can be really just really received in a way by a wider audience, just because a lot of it rhymes and there's rhythm to it. But like we were talking about truths before, right? Like the messages I'm trying to convey are still the same messages. They could be, they could be really deeply complex. They could be really abstract. They could be really nuanced. But if I'm able to get a million or millions and millions and millions of people to listen to the message, well, for me, that's actually doing good. And so, Socrates' definition of an orator, I don't think every single expert is a great communicator, because that's just that's not their domain of expertise. They haven't spent 10,000 hours learning how to articulate, the scientific discovery. They've spent 10,000 hours in the lab, running experiments and, testing these different hypotheses. And so for me, it's like, there's a place for both. I really, I'm deeply grateful for how much communication has been a big part of my life. But whether we talk about interpreters, Mark Manson being just a brilliant interpreter, so he's been really rewarded with a lot of, not only, quote unquote, industry fandom or fame in that sense. But there's also a lot of social currency because, he just recently wrote Will Smith's memoir, or like co-wrote Will Smith's memoir. The only reason he was able to do that, right, is he's literally has the evidence. He's shown people, it's not just told people, and he's really good at distilling down ideas in a way that's accessible to a wider audience. And so, in that sense, he's really earned his chops. And I really believe there's a real role for that, whether it's through written communication, whether it's through musicians being able to, communicate through music. And for me, it just happens to be like, rhyme unintended there, it just happens to be spoken word poetry. Well, I just couldn't help but add that rhyming triplet. But yeah, it just happens to be through the poetry that I write. And I've just been speaking for a very long time. And so, what I find really interesting is the idea of a skill stack, which comes from Scott Adams. But actually, if you even look back into, how it happens in nature, if you look at graphene, which is one of the strongest materials known to man right now, like if you actually break down the composition of what graphene is, it's just stacked layers of carbon, right? And so it's because it's stacked all at once. And you think about like a twig, right? A twig can be broken, but if there's a bunch of twigs, it's really hard to break.
That's the fascies. Yeah.
Exactly. And so when you think about this idea of skills, and you think about, unique intersections and people's scarce resources, you start to see that, I might, have a lot of experience speaking from a professional point of view. I may have been in publications, but then I also may be really interested in business, but I also am really interested in artistic endeavors. I'm also interested in poetry. Then you start to see the intersection of my skills become increasingly small, because there's very, very few people, if anyone at all, and my assertion is, when you really go into your unique intersection, there's no one like you, because you actually have the monopoly, and that actually does become the dichotomy, right? It actually becomes binary. A famous, it's one of the founders of PayPal, Peter Thiel, wrote a famous business book called 0 to 1. And that's one of the key takeaways from that as well. It is this idea that you either have a monopoly over something or you don't. Now, I would assert you have a monopoly over being your authentic self when you really find your authentic self. And so
whether or not there's a market for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it's a level of tinkering. And, I also just have a fuck ton of fun doing it. I like speaking. I like having conversations like this, and I like writing poetry and I like performing it. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for spending the time with me.
Likewise. And Godspeed with JQN Studios.
Thank you, my man.
God, that's a secular God. That's a non-theistic God.
I know the number of times that you went with like a religious angle, I was like, where's he getting this from? Because I've never heard it before.
Catholic upbringing. That was my interview with James Nguyen. Again, you can find his poetry online at JQN Studios on YouTube, and at the same handle on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you, James, for that long that long in the making interview. And thanks to all of you for listening. You can write me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com with questions, comments, suggestions, or furious complaints. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.